A billion people will be displaced by climate change, the Great Reset explained. Euphemism. A euphemism is a mild, indirect word or expression substituted for one considered to be too harsh or blunt in reference to something unpleasant. And according to English historian Mark Rossman, euphemisms were the Nazis' normal mode of communicating about murder. The Paris Agreement, an international treaty on climate change. The Paris Agreement is a legally binding treaty that was adopted by 196 member states of the UN, effectively all nations on Earth, at the Climate Change Conference in Paris in 2015. The main goal of the agreement was, and still is, presumably, to cut global greenhouse gases in order to limit global temperature increases as close as possible to 1.5 degrees Celsius, that is, below pre-industrial levels. The language of the agreement was framed in terms of a benign intergovernmental set of protocols. However, it's to be noted that what was initially an entirely voluntary program has slowly turned into mandatory requirements, one of which is the result that Africa's resources must remain in the ground in order to preserve the climate. Present-day Africa. According to the most recent estimates, India and China's population stand at 1.4 billion each, and coincidentally, so does that of Africa. Africa, the world's second largest continent, making up 20% of the Earth's total land area and endowed with an abundance of natural resources. Yet in spite of all this, countries in Africa have some of the lowest human development indexes in the world in terms of life expectancy, education, and income levels. Nearly all of the 30 countries with the lowest HDIs, as reported by the United Nations, are in Africa. Among them, Niger, with minerals such as gold, coal, iron ore, and uranium, of which it is the fourth largest producer in the world, and the Central African Republic with its diamond mines and waterfalls, sources of hydroelectric power that could produce about 4/5 of the country's electricity. Sierra Leone, Côte d'Ivoire, Liberia, Burkina Faso, Angola, the Congo, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo still not having been spared. Time and again, Africa's timeline is one of failed states, coups and counter-coups, and inherent exploitation from Western powers. Famine, disease, wars have ravaged the continent despite its potential, richness of resources, and relentless streams of foreign aid. Much of the continent, up to 90%, remains in poverty. It bears noting, however, that although African leaders and heads of state co-sign onto treaties such as the Paris Agreement, they've also borne the brunt of both the ravages of slavery and occupation of their lands, and as such are highly unlikely to follow through to the letter. This comes irrespective of the level of indebtedness and against the pressing needs of their people. Very few to none would once again agree to be subjected to the same indignities, and I quote, for the collective good, and for a cause unto which they did not contribute, the mass degradation of the environment. The Scramble for Africa and King Leopold's Congo. It is at this point that the emerging blueprint that is the World War II theater of war merges with that of the infamous Scramble for Africa. And whereas the term displacement is used as a euphemism for the extermination of all Africans on one end, climate change becomes the pretext or excuse for appropriating their land on the other, resulting in a renewed scramble for Africa's resources. The Berlin Conference. The Berlin Conference was organized and hosted by then-Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, the first Chancellor of Germany. Having opened on the 15th of November in 1884, by the time of its conclusion, 3 months later, no one had benefited more than the man who had not been there, King Leopold II. In actuality, it was him who had sponsored the 1884-85 Berlin Conference, which had effectively set out the rules of control of African territories, and behind the scenes had coordinated through proxy emissaries, dignitaries, and heads of state. And in the end, although not present, King Leopold II of Belgium had secured a considerable portion of land, approximately 13% of the continent. The events of the conference were captured in the book King Leopold's Ghosts by Adam Hochschild. Conclusion. Ultimately, Africans not only have the right to life, but more critical to the situation, the fundamental human right to self-determination, an integral element of basic human rights and fundamental freedoms. This is according to a UN Committee on Social, Humanitarian and Culture. In a session that was concluded at the 68th General Assembly, then representative of the Maldives put it succinctly. It is only through the realization of this very basic right of the people to determine, with no compulsion or coercion, their own future, political status, and independence, that we can begin to address others, such as dignity, justice, progress, and equity.